V for vigilante. For months, Ada County Sheriff David Updike had been investigating a secretive group of armed extremists living at the periphery of his southwest Idaho jurisdiction. When an informant provided him with a membership list of the armed band, Updike wasted no time. He obtained arrest warrants, organized a large, heavily armed strike force, and made a beeline for the Payette River Valley. The warrants were a ruse. Updike wasn't planning a mass arrest, he was plotting a massacre. His quarry was a group of about 24 law-abiding citizens who had organized a private vigilance committee under the leadership of an equable local farmer named William J. McConnell. Some of the vigilantes had welcomed Updike's election as Ada County's first sheriff in 1864, only to discover in short order that he was a predator rather than a peace officer. Historian Randy Stapoulos summarizes the matter quite tidily in his slender but fascinating book Outlaw Tales of Idaho. Ada County's new sheriff, quote, was moonlighting as a stage robber. Updike's inspiration was Henry Plummer, a New England native who carved out a criminal career that spanned several states and ran up a fairly sizable body count. Swept into Northern California just as the gold rush was waning, Plummer, who was blessed with glibness and a certain facile charm, was elected a town marshal. After gunning down 2 men for no defensible reason, Plummer spent a few years in San Quentin before being paroled and exiled from the state. News of mining opportunities in northern Idaho sent Plummer to Lewiston, which at the time was Idaho's territorial capital. He quickly fell into the company of thieves and rustlers and did a pretty brisk business in robbery until he was forced to flee to Bannack, Montana, where he once again sought out the company of the local criminal element. Following a brief flirtation with local politics, Plummer found more honest work as a pimp. His business partner was a prostitute posing as his wife. This was a profitable arrangement until Plummer and his wife, while visiting a saloon, encountered a man named Cleveland who knew of the ex-convict's dealings in California. Within a few days, Plummer had killed Cleveland and forced the sheriff to flee, creating a vacancy that he eagerly filled. Plummer moved with dispatch to make the most of his new position. As sheriff, he was provided with detailed information about local ex-cons and criminal suspects, whom he treated as potential recruits for his road agent syndicate. He was also able to gather intelligence on potential victims. He used those assets to great advantage in arranging the October 1863 robbery-murder of Lewiston dry goods dealer Lloyd Magruder, who was one of 5 members of a pack train slaughtered by a team of Plummer's road agents at a camp in the Bitterroot Mountains. Magruder, who had made the trek from Lewiston to Bannack in order to sell goods to miners in Montana, made the fatal mistake of hiring some local help for the return trip. Plummer, who was aware that Magruder was headed back to Idaho with a large quantity of money, arranged for several of his thugs to hire on with the merchant. The robbers made off with an estimated $18,000 in gold dust. A few months later, a well-respected young rancher named Nicholas Thibault was murdered during another robbery carried out by a road agent gang. Puzzled and infuriated by the sheriff's apparent indifference to the onslaught, local ranchers created a vigilance committee and set out to find and punish the robbers. One of the perpetrators, a man named Erastus Yeager, informed the vigilantes that Sheriff Plummer was actually the kingpin of the criminal syndicate. In January 1864, 7 months after the road agent gang had begun its depredations, Sheriff Plummer was marched up the steps of a scaffold he had built himself. Just before the noose was put around his neck, Plummer reportedly made a desperate final offer to the vigilantes. Quote, "Give me 2 hours and a horse. I can bring back my weight in gold." He wasn't given the opportunity. Sheriff Plummer's history is worth reviewing since it eerily prefigured the career of Sheriff Updike. While Plummer was busy organizing a criminal syndicate in Montana, his former colleagues in Lewiston drifted south. After it had oozed its way into Boise, Plummer's old gang quickly congealed into a political elite. Boise City, as it was called, was a fair approximation of the Mos Eisley spaceport. In their book Gold Rushes and Mining Camps of the Early American West, historians Vardis Fisher and Opal Laurel Holmes describe the town as being in thrall to, quote, "a splendid assortment of murderers, robbers, and tin-horn gamblers, the offscourings of all the abandoned and worn-out mining camps in the territory." In other words, it had all the necessary ingredients to create the engine of misery called a government. As Augustine pointed out long ago, a government is simply a gang that, quote, acquires territory, establishes a base, captures cities and subdues peoples, and then obtains supposed respectability, not by the renouncing of aggression, but by the attainment of impunity. In 1864, Plummer's old criminal syndicate followed that time-honored formula with admirable fidelity by taking control of Boise's Democratic Party apparatus and electing David Updike to be Ada County's first sheriff. Prior to the advent of state-imposed civilization in southwestern Idaho, crimes against persons and property were an occasional problem. The arrival of government law enforcement resulted in a tsunami-magnitude crime wave. Armed robbers operating out of Updike's livery stable and under his protection preyed on stagecoaches and plundered local farms. The syndicate also defrauded local merchants and businessmen by passing bogus gold dust, lead shavings covered with a thin layer of gold. This racket was in some ways a frontier-era foreshadowing of the officially sanctioned counterfeiting carried on today by the Federal Reserve System. The gold dust fraud ring enjoyed the protection of the legitimate government, which profited from its crimes. William McConnell was among those who initially welcomed the arrival of legitimate law enforcement. His opinion changed abruptly after a horse that was stolen from him materialized in Updike's stable. McConnell was forced to hire an attorney and spend 2 days in court to retrieve his stolen property, spending more in legal fees than the market value of his horse. As a weary and frustrated McConnell departed the courtroom, a gang of Updike's roughs taunted the mild-mannered farmer. His patience finally exhausted, McConnell confronted the gangsters and warned them that the next time one of his horses went missing, he would track down the thief and, quote, "there will be no lawsuit about it." A few days later, McConnell and 2 neighbors discovered that 5 horses and 4 mules, livestock worth more than 2,000 pre-Federal Reserve dollars, were missing. McConnell and his neighbors took off in pursuit of the rustlers, returning 2 weeks later with the missing animals and a few honorably earned battle scars. This was, for all intents and purposes, the Payette Vigilance Committee's first campaign. Updike continued to abet armed robbery and shelter criminals. He refused to investigate crimes plausibly suspected to be the work of his political confederates. Practically the only attention law-abiding people received from their local sheriff was when he or his deputies would pay a visit to collect taxes, a form of legal theft used to underwrite the local government's clandestine crimes. As Albert J. Nock pointed out in his definitive work, Our Enemy the State, government doesn't seek to abolish or suppress crime, but rather, quote, claims and exercises a monopoly of crime, and it makes this monopoly as strict as it can. In principle, this means that the government must also claim a monopoly on the use of force and treat as criminals anyone who would undermine that monopoly. This is why the most urgent priority for the Ada County Sheriff's Department was to eliminate McConnell's Vigilance Committee once the identity of its leader became known. Updike's crackdown was, quote, to be conducted in legal form, observed Nathaniel P. Longford in his 1890 account Vigilante Days and Ways. However, quote, in making the arrest, Updike and his posse proposed to shoot the leaders of the vigilantes and screen themselves under the plea that they had resisted. Thus it was that Updike gathered a posse composed of 15 of the worst men in the territory and headed to Horseshoe Bend, where they were to join with another group similar in size and identical in composition before heading to the Payette River settlement. Sheriff Updike's plan may have succeeded were it not for 2 critical developments. First, a Boise resident sympathetic to the vigilantes learned of the plot. While Updike's posse took a longer route to join up with reinforcements at Horseshoe Bend, the vigilante sympathizer raced ahead to warn McConnell. Second, Updike's would-be allies in Horseshoe Bend failed to materialize. Thus, when the sheriff and his gang arrived at Payette River, they had lost the advantage of surprise and were outnumbered at least 2-1. The surprised and frustrated sheriff was forced to parley with McConnell and, quote, was obliged to comply with all the terms prescribed by the vigilantes, records Longford. McConnell and his men agreed to travel to Boise to answer the warrants, but they refused to surrender their weapons or to be taken into Updike's custody. With the help of legal counsel, the vigilantes were able to get the criminal complaints dismissed, leaving Updike humiliated and vulnerable. A few months after the debacle in Payette River, a stagecoach bound from Montana to Utah was ambushed by a gang of road agents in southeast Idaho's Portneuf Canyon. 5 passengers were murdered, and $86,000 in gold was taken from the coach. Stage driver Charlie Parks and a passenger who survived the attack made their way to Boise, where they positively identified Updike and a rough named Brocky Jack as two of the robbers. Neither was ever prosecuted for the crime, and the gold, which was marked and numbered, was never found.